the claim that sociologists are making, that I am making, namely that love changes, that love is shaped by historical, economic, political, social circumstances, is counterintuitive. It goes against a very long, I would say even poetic tradition, literary tradition, which views the feeling of falling in love as universal. So there seems to be something about love that is recurrent, but the expressions of love and the ways in which people understand it vary, and this is the quote by Coetzee that you mentioned at the beginning. So I would say that in a media-saturated culture, because since the beginning of the 20th century, through the media industries, we have been constantly told that to live happily is to fall in love. Because so many TV series, so many movies, so many women magazines, so many self-help books are about the art of falling in love and staying in love, I would say that, first of all, love has become the main way in which modern people shape themselves. So love is a kind of modern religion. I'm not the first to say it. Other people have said it, but I think this diagnostic is true. And in the same way that religion has been questioned, in other words, in the same way that religion has been disenchanted, in the same way that people asked questions about the big myth of religion, I think our younger generations are struggling with the myth or the religion of love. They want to believe in it, and yet they don't really, because divorce, for example, separation, have become routine aspects of relationships, because so many relationships start and end immediately or quite quickly. This is the theme of my more recent book called The End of Love. So the end of love has become so deeply embedded in the experience of romance and love that I think young people and even less young people have developed a cultural irony towards love, and are in a strange way, I would say, even much more pragmatic about it. So if you ask me what has changed, I think one of the things that has changed is that people don't really trust themselves when they fall in love or when somebody else falls in love with them. And what I've seen with my interviewees over and over again is that people, refer more and more to a model of relationship where it works. They get together, and then they get together more, and then they get together more and more and more, and they see there is no friction, there is no tension, that people infer, quite interestingly, from the fact that they're feeling good, they infer that this must be a good relationship. So it's a very different way of falling in love than the one where you had a model of love at first sight, and this model was of love as something absolute that was geared to one person, that was all-consuming, and that would accompany you throughout all your life. We've moved, I think, to a conception of love that is much more pragmatic, and also much less absolute, and in that sense much less religious. And it's much more pragmatic because it pays much closer attention to how this is making me feel. So I would say, yes, that we have moved culturally. I think there is a switch, which doesn't mean that they are not, as in religion, that remnants or a background or something of the old myth does not still exert its power. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't want it to happen in the way the myth describes it. But it does mean that people are faced with the increasing difficulties there are of building relationships around the myth. So this book and the one I mentioned before, The End of Love, are about showing the objective conditions, sociological conditions, that make it very difficult to live the myth of love. So the myth of love corresponded to specific time. It was suited, say, to the 18th century, to the novel, to the 19th century. It is no longer suited to an era, for example, where sexual freedom reigns supreme. The idea of romantic love is based on the idea of scarcity. It is based on the idea of transgressing the injunction or the commandments of community and family, such as in Romeo and Juliet. But in the era of sexual freedom, where you are allowed to, in fact, choose whoever you want, then I think, curiously enough, falling in love becomes plagued by the problem of choice, of knowing who I want, of knowing what I want, and of knowing whether this person is the right choice or not. So we have, in a way, created conditions, and there are many more reasons that I'm not mentioning yet. We have created the conditions because of which the ideal of romantic love, as we know it from 18th or 19th century literature, is no longer really possible.
Wow. So you've experienced this and observed this in different countries. By the way, we are here on behalf of Arranged by Jewish Culture in Sweden, and I know that you've observed the same phenomenon in Israel, in France, in the States, that love today is universal in the sense that we pick our own mate or partner, whereas 200 years ago, family did that for us, or even the village had to agree on who was a good partner. And you do often go back to Jane Austen, in fact. Her stories intrigues about love. And for us, it seems that love now should be so much easier, because I get to pick who I am attracted to. I mean, if that person obviously feels the same. Back then, somebody else did that for me. And yet, we seem not to find a way to really make it work. You talked about divorce, you talked about how people are pragmatic about love, because you know that this is probably not going to last for, the rest of my life. The disenchantment of love that you were talking about, is that a natural consequence of sexual liberation, of female liberation, or is that a problem? Is that what's holding us back a little bit?
What does it mean to disenchant? To disenchant, for example, nature, means that instead of believing this tree contains a hidden god, and this tree is a divinity, or this animal contains a divinity, it means that I see a tree as pure matter. And I see this animal as a biological entity. That's disenchantment. Disenchantment is not, it is, for example, feeling attracted to someone and telling myself, oh, it's hormonal, or oh, I didn't have sex for a long time and therefore I feel this urge. It is then in a way refusing to view our attraction to someone else or our belief as the result of some transcendent entity, of some magic entity that is outside of me, but rather it means that I will see my attraction, my feelings, my emotions as the result of things that are explicable, whether by genes, whether by hormones, whether by social class, whether by economics. That's what it means to disenchant disenchant the world. Now, if you're asking me, is this a good or bad thing to disenchant? You know, it depends for what. It's both good and bad, because it's good because I want to gain knowledge, because I believe in knowledge. I mean, unless you don't believe in knowledge, if you don't believe at all in the emancipatory value of knowledge, and some people don't, by the way, some people don't believe in the emancipatory of knowledge. But if you do believe in the emancipatory value of knowledge, then I think it's a good thing to disenchant, knowing that, of course, it means we live in a world that is, you know, to use Max Weber's view on, he called it the iron cage. You live then in a world that is much colder. You live in a world that has less illusions. And you live in a world that does not enable the fervor and the heat almost of belief. So that is the price we have to pay, in a way, for the knowledge-saturated society we live in. And also, you know, I want to say that feminism is such a disenchanting view of love, because feminism has said basically love is the mechanism through which women accept to be dominated. You know, the number of women who are battered, for example, and who have to bear the extreme control of their partner in the name of love. For a very long time, this behavior was thought to be a loving behavior. A man who would slap his wife in public because she made him jealous, this type of jealousy was thought to be an expression of a man's love. So
it can still be in some societies.
It can still be, exactly. So feminism has shown that love is underpinned by power relationships, and that you really cannot separate the ways in which men and women love each other today from the enactment or performance of power. For example, you know, men's notorious aloofness or reluctance to commit themselves. This is something that I interpret as an expression of their power. Just one example. So again, feminism contributed a great deal to disenchant love relationships and to kind of unveil, to tear off that beautiful veil of love and say, look, behind the veil, there are power relationships. And of course, you know, this makes it less easy to have relationships. But I think that we should destroy illusions, because this is the better way to reconstruct our world. If we only destroy illusions, then we remain empty-handed. And I think the point of sociology and philosophy, this is, I mean, you find it all already in Socrates. This is exactly what Socrates does with the people he talks to. He destroys their illusions, he destroys their reasoning, and after he has done that, he builds it again, and then points to the right values. So I think culturally we are in that moment.
Okay. So culturally we are in this moment. Again, going back to traditional societies, even in the West, you say that, for example, back in Jane Austen's time, a man could not be what you call a commitment phobic, because a man by 25 or 30 had to be married. In fact, it would be a shame for a man not to be married. So this sort of arranged everybody in the sense that people got married, you know, at a reasonable age, because that society told them to. Whereas nowadays, you said the aloofness of men, I like that expression very much, by the way, to continue living as if you were 20, you know, going on for many years, because nothing puts pressure on a man to commit, early at least in his life. Now, you also argue that, obviously, I mean, there's physical violence in lots of heterosexual relationships and others, but a more subtle form of submission or oppression is the fact that we engage later in life. So basically lots of women, my age for example, end up fighting the biological clock if you want to make a family. And this is a new form of power for men, because the buffet of women of all ages is so much bigger and they can be so much pickier. Would you like to develop that a little bit? Because is this a form of masculine power, that a new masculine power, I would say?
Thank you very much, Joanna. You laid it out beautifully. So, yeah, let's go back first of all to more patriarchal or traditional patriarchal societies, as you put it. In a traditionally patriarchal society, a man really, really wants to get married for two reasons at least. One is that marriage is one of the chief, if not the chief, economic operation in people's lives. They will acquire, marriage and inheritance. Otherwise, most people will find it very difficult to save money and to have, to acquire money through work. This is something that will change tremendously with capitalism. But in a pre-capitalist society, so marriage is very important for a man because he is likely to acquire either a woman, either a worker who will help me work the land, or money in the form of a dowry. And there is another reason why marriage is important for a man. It is the fact that to be a patriarch means, by definition, to be able to rule over a woman, children, and possibly servants. That's what gives you your status as the head, what's called the head of a household. You are the head of a household only if you have those things. If you don't have them, then you're not the head of a household. So marriage is a kind of small enterprise in which, as a man, you become immediately the CEO. So, of course, everybody wants to be the CEO of that small enterprise. And that is why, in fact, when you look at courtship, quite often the one who was uncertain and unsure was the woman. And that's why you had courtship as a ritual. Courtship as a ritual, had men convince the women to marry them.
She was supposed to say no a few times, even.
She could say no, she could say yes. It depends really on the places. And so I would say that even though women were deprived, of course, of any and all, practically all rights, certainly in the economic sphere, in the emotional sphere, at least for the upper middle class and middle class women, they had a certain amount of emotional leverage on men in what concerns the marriage proposal. Now, capitalism changes entirely this ecology. Because what does capitalism mean? It means that people can increasingly rely on the market for their for their economic survival. They do not need anymore the family or the community approval. So capitalism really disrupts vastly the traditional ways in which men and women meet and choose each other, and empowers, if you want to use that word, empowers individuals to, it gives the impression or the illusion that individuals are acting of their own will. But actually what they're doing is simply, what has changed is simply the source of economic survival. It doesn't mean we don't inherit anymore. Of course we do. But what capitalism has done is disentangle, disconnect much more than in the past, the choice of a mate and economic survival. So, having said that, we want to add to this the sexual revolution after the 1960s. And the sexual revolution means that, I mean, an enormous, I want to say, you know, an enormous revolution, maybe one of the biggest revolutions since the beginning of Christianity happened, was that sexuality was no longer really regulated, neither by religious authorities, nor by communities, nor by families. Of course, I'm aware of the fact that this regulation was always imperfect, and that in many Christian countries there were, for example, a lot of what's called illegitimate birth, with people having relationships before marriage or outside marriage. So, obviously, but still, the sexuality of men and women was heavily, heavily regulated. So that if you had sex with a woman, and even if she did not become pregnant, but certainly if she became pregnant, you were asked to marry her. You had actually to marry her. It was very much an imposition. Don Juan, the famous 17th century play by Molière, which he took from Spanish a play, is about a man. You know, we are all, when we think today, what's the big deal? I mean, the man wants to have affairs with many women. We are hard pressed to understand what's the big deal. But that's the point. In the 17th century, to do that is really to challenge God. It is to challenge the heart of society. And we have all become Don Juan today. And in becoming Don Juan, because, as I said, the sexual revolution, but also because the sexual revolution was largely supported, was largely sustained by a consumer culture, by media culture, which was avid of portraying sex and sexuality and sexual bodies and beautiful bodies as a way also to promote their goods. So because of that, then I would say we have what I would call, using an economic terminology, deregulated markets for sexual and romantic encounters. That is, individuals have only themselves, so to speak, to offer on the market, and they become as if a commodity, a desirable, undesirable commodity. Now, what does this mean? Given that men still dominate women on the market economically, that is, men are paid more, usually in many, many countries, still paid more. They still enjoy higher positions than women, even though women went into the labor market. So that means that if you want to have children, it means that for women, choosing a man who has more economic power is still very important for them. So it gives, if you want, some leverage to the man, because there are more women of a lower social class who want the same men who are of a higher social class. This is why women are hypergamic. They tend to marry with men of a higher social status than themselves, because they know or anticipate that their own will be low. So they're choosing a man who will enable their own economic survival. But also a big change happened, which is that it used to be that men were very worried about their descendants. And this is true, you know, up until quite late. And you certainly see it in the Bible. And you certainly see it in the history of the kings and monarchs. Descendants is very important. Not any descendants, male descendants is very important, because the male only is the one who will carry your name. So men were historically responsible, if you want, for the business of reproduction. And very strangely, with modernity, something very strange has happened. Women have become the only one to care about reproduction, to care, I mean, emotionally and culturally. the Bridget Jones phenomenon. I hope you know, all of you, the wonderful trilogy of Bridget Jones, a single woman who is desperately looking for a partner to have, because she also wants children. So Bridget Jones is a contemporary figure. She's not a remnant of the past. In Christian Europe, for example, there was much more room for spinsters or women who did not marry, because, let's not forget it, Catholicism had not only allowed being unmarried, but had made it, in fact, a higher way of being, a higher state of being. So being unmarried, I want to say, was not as stigmatized as it is today, as being single and childless. So women became indeed and responsible for the desire of having children, and because having sex and the pill, in fact, it enables you to have sex indefinitely without the danger of being pregnant. The biological clock has become, again, a cultural issue, because we now live in with the possibility of having lots of sexual partners. So what I want to say now is that there is increasingly, I think, a problem of reproduction, of sexual reproduction, with many people not getting married, not having children for all kinds of reasons. And so this business of social reproduction, which is central to society, having children in order to be able to reproduce themselves, itself, having children has become a major social problem.
Do you think that with society changing, because although men are paid more than women, it's slowly, or it's even rapidly changing in lots of, at least, European countries? I mean, in cities like London, even Paris, single women make more money than single men, for example. There are a few examples of this also. You can see in the educational system that girls are a lot more successful, so there might be, or there will probably be, an economic shift a little bit in the future. Do you think that the fact that you write about as well, men who are very reluctant to commit in their 30s, maybe in their 40s, could it also be a sort of psychological revenge, because women are taking so much more power away from them economically or in the labor market, and this is somehow the only area to hold on to for a man, where he can be the determinator of, whether there's going to be a family or a marriage, because he can wait for a lot longer, I mean, for biological reasons.
I've never thought of it. We need to think about it with you now. Masculinity, traditional masculinity, is power. It is competing with others for power. So masculinity is about seeming unwounded and loathing the appearance or the display of weakness. So men, in a way, have a problem, or there is a built-in contradiction in masculinity, in the masculinity, not in men. I don't want to talk about men. I want to talk masculinity as a cultural prototype, and obviously knowing that some men correspond to the prototype and some men don't. But it's the prototype really that interests me. So the prototype of masculinity,
we call it not all men.
Right. So the prototype of masculinity is a prototype of an unwounded creature, of someone who is not vulnerable, and therefore who cannot and should not make himself vulnerable to other human beings, and who performs. And so for many of these men, many men have lost power objectively in the economic sphere. And if you take working class men, it used to be the case that working class men had working class job with big layers of people over them. But there was one place where they were the boss. It was at home with their wives. And these men have lost this privilege too. And sometimes these working class men have a very precarious work situation, and often depend on the much more stable job of their wives, who have pink-collar occupations. They work in the service industry or they work as cleaning ladies or as nannies, and have simply for the more middle class or upper middle classes, and have more stable jobs, and they have to rely on these women. So it means a complete, I would say, it means that the earth below the feet of these men has shaken. I don't think it is foreign, by the way, to some of the populist movements. I think a part of it is also about this profound change in definitions of traditional source of masculinity. I mean, you look at all the populist leaders, Salvini, Bolsonaro, Trump, they're all real men, if you see what I mean. You know, they all correspond to a very traditional type of powerful, unwounded masculinity.
A man from the 1950s or so. Maybe Trump being the exception.
Well, I don't know where he's from.
Yeah, there's no decade for him there.
So I want to go back to your question about revenge. I'm not sure if I would put it as a revenge. I would say that interpersonal relationships and sexuality are the only place still where men can still try, at least, to exercise their power. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, as we have seen with Me Too. And I think a great deal also of Me Too is about this renegotiation, redefinition of men's power inside or within the realm of sexuality. Whether it's revenge or not, I don't know. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I prefer not to use psychological categories to understand the behavior. I simply prefer to see what has changed in men's lives to understand maybe what is happening. So certainly sexuality and the realm of intimate relationships are a prime arena and site for the exercise of power. And so what happens to that power? Now, Harvey Weinstein would certainly not need any revenge, because I think for him it was just a natural way to exercise his authority. So I think you have probably all kinds of configurations of men simply thinking that their social economic power is naturally reflected in their relationships with women, and some men may be compensating for the lack of power in the socioeconomic realm, in the realm of interpersonal relations.
Looking at statistics and research, it's still a fact that men are very well off in marriage. They are healthier, they live longer, compared to men who are not married, for example. Still, they seem more reluctant to engage than women, or than in Jane Austen's times, for example. And there's also what that you mentioned, that the new working class of men who do not have the capacity, they have nothing to offer, I would say, on the marriage market, as you call it. And there's also the incel phenomenon, the incel movement, men living, without sex, having no access to women and to sex, and being very, revengeful because of that. All of this comes in a time where women, all of a sudden, I would say, in lots of European countries, in France, they voted this yesterday, in fact, in the Senate, I think. Women can have children by insemination. Women can become mothers on their own. Now, this is a very new phenomenon. Will this change? Because men sort of become obsolete in this case. If you don't want a man, but you want a child, you can have it anyway. Is this going to change, you think, the power balance between the sexes?
Well, in the country, one of the countries I live in, Israel, the PMA, the assisted procreation for women, has been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think Israel was actually pioneer.
Okay.
Not for progressive reasons, because Israel, for demographic reasons, Israel wants to encourage birth at all costs.
All right.
And so, in a very interesting way, a kind of unprogressive reason or rationale gave rise to very progressive legislation over the capacity of women to use state funds to actually reproduce. So we have a place where we can ask this question, and I can tell you that it didn't change at all.
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. I don't think so. So as long as you need more to change relationships, you need to really change the whole matrix of heterosexuality, of heterosexual relationships. By the way, I don't think that among the young people, the relations of power are quite as present as people of my generation.
Right.
I do think there is a shift there with sexual identity becoming also much more fluid, and men and women being also much more open to the possibilities of having stable relationships with people of their own sex. So some tectonic changes are happening. I don't think they will happen for people of my generation, but I think the younger, the people who are born, what I call, the people who are born into the internet and the cell phones, I think for these people, there is much less that is taken for granted for boys, much less. It doesn't mean that structures of power do not still exist more or less the same way they have always been. When you look at the structure, that is the military, politics, economics, if you take these three domains, they're still all widely male-dominated. So the structure has not changed.
Okay.
But within the frame of the structure, there are some movements happening among the young people.
Right. There's so much to talk about. We have to mention, or at least briefly speak about the online internet dating culture. You did write a book about it as well, called Intimacies. A lot has happened since then, I guess. How has this transformed the marriage market and our view on love?
Well, taken the phenomenon of Tinder, which was a heterosexual imitation of Grindr,
right,
which was a homosexual app, and male homosexual app, and that app was quite interesting, I think, because it completely autonomized. I would call it, as a sociologist, completely autonomized sex. In other words, men on Grindr, gay men would send each other not only pictures of their faces, but pictures of their penises. So it means for me, as a sociologist, that what you are creating the interaction about is simply about pure sex. and sexuality, whereas I think heterosexuality, especially for women, is more complicated. It's still more intertwined with remnants of a ideology of sexuality with emotions, etc. Tinder did the same revolution. It enabled men and women to meet, to meet quickly, because since it's geo-localized, as Grindr was, it enables you to identify who is available 500 meters from you, and to have sex with them, in the same day. So Tinder is about the autonomization of sexuality. Now, what I think has happened in the last maybe 10, 20 years is the autonomization of sexuality, what I would call the autonomization of sexuality, and the extraordinary increase of sexual choice due to these apps. With some phenomenon such as new phenomenon, sex addiction, which you have to associate to pornography, to the fact that pornography remains the biggest industry on the internet. The internet enables a consumption of pornography that is unprecedented.
Because the supply is never ending.
The supply is never ending, but also it is unchecked. You don't have to go to a store. I think it was in a Woody Allen movie where you see him take a porn tape, and come
Pay for it,
and he's very embarrassed. He tries to, or porn magazine. So that's over. You don't need to be embarrassed anymore, because you can access pornography in the privacy of your home. So this has given rise to sex addiction, and I would say also sex boredom. I was having dinner with a British journalist a few months ago, and she is quite openly, she uses Tinder very openly. And then she told me, I would say she was about 40, and then she told me, it's amazing. I mean, today my idea of having a great time is to stay at home, watch TV, and be alone, and not to go and have sex, because she finds it such hard work. It's such hard work. So there has been a shift again. If what is exciting is being on your own, as opposed to the endless possibilities that Tinder is giving you.
Of course. Time has run out. Thank you so much, Eva Illouz, for coming here. Thank you to Jewish Culture in Sweden, of course, for arranging this. And, when love will end in your next book. Looking forward to that too.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.